Hello, and welcome to Joe and Cat Chats. Today we have a special guest, it's a special episode. We're talking about marijuana and racism with Staysee Marie from The Sanctuary, who that show is actually also on Tastemaker on Dash Radio. So catch The Sanctuary right after Joe and Cat Chats on Wednesdays, starting at 11 for Joe and Cat Chats and 1 for The Sanctuary. Today is April 20th, 2021, and we're recording live on Facebook and YouTube at /JoeNiceDJ. So I'm super excited to get into our topic today. Stacy, would you mind giving us a quick bio and just tell us who you are?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy for you to have started bringing guests in. So I feel really fortunate to be one of the first. So my name is Staysee Marie. I use she, her pronouns. I am a nurse by trade. Most of my career has spent in harm reduction or in sexual health, and more recently kind of at the intersection of all three, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Not necessarily rock and roll, but music, doing harm reduction at music festivals up here in the Pacific Northwest. One of them being Base Coast and a couple other smaller ones. I also work in sexual violence prevention, and yeah, love talking about these things, especially with you two.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And we're so grateful to have you on. And yeah, it's a pretty exciting day because you're our first guest ever on Joe and Cat Chats. So yeah, so next I just want to say my usual how are you to both of you. Let me know what's happening. How's life? Joe?
First of all, ladies, great to be with both of you. Second of all, I am slightly nervous. Not nervous necessarily because Stacy's our first guest, because we know what we know to do, Kat. So guests are no big deal, even though Stacy is a big deal. But I'm more nervous about the pending verdict for the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm worried about what is going to happen. I'm worried about various cities around the United States that have already loaded up on National Guard personnel: Cincinnati, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, of course. So I'm worried and concerned about whatever might come about today. We're getting news and notifications that the verdict is coming today by 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're currently filming right now, and it is 3:33 Eastern Standard Time. So sometime in the next 25 to 30 minutes, we might be getting notification about the verdict for Derek Chauvin. Again, we want to make sure that we continue to stand with marginalized communities around the United States and around the world. And I almost put this mask on today, but I didn't put it on today because it might affect the sound. But that's not important. The message that is on this mask it says, "I can't breathe." I'm going to make sure I camerify it properly. There it is. "I can't breathe." Out to Maggie in Minneapolis for hooking me up with that mask. We want to make sure that these words are remembered by people who have been unnecessarily killed at the hands of police, whether it's Cedric Chouvet in France, whether it's Javier Ordóñez in Bogotá, Colombia, whether it is Eric Garner, whether it is George Floyd, whether it is Freddie Gray, whether it is Oscar Grant, whether it is Philando Castile. We want to make sure that we understand that police genocide is a huge problem in these United States. It is directly linked to the militarization of police and the disparities between Black people and white people as prescribed by the 14th Amendment of the United States, equal protection under the law. And part of the reason why you and I, and of course the magnificent Stacy, are having this conversation today is to discuss the disparities in marijuana, otherwise known as cannabis, and racism. If people like me are more likely to get arrested for possessing marijuana more often than people like the two of you. So we're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk about, I guess, the medicinal benefits of marijuana. We're going to talk about anything weed today on 420. So that's the conversation. That's what it is. That's my story, and I for damn sure am sticking to it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. We're all just sort of waiting on edge for that verdict because it's going to determine how to proceed in the next little while, for sure, for many of our I guess, cities and communities. How are you doing, Stacy? Anything on your mind today?
Thank you for that intro and that check-in, Joe. And if at any point we need to pivot the conversation, please, this is the space to do that. Yeah, I mean, my baseline during COVID is kind of, I just feel like I'm this body moving through space, and every day is another day, and this is one of them. I'm doing okay, all things considered, but I am very looking forward to this combo for a while now, especially as Joe said, there are links to increased policing and the likelihood that someone's going to have contact with police, and as we'll get into, bias to come in with policing around decisions made around personal amounts of marijuana. So yeah, I'm looking forward to today. How are you?
Yeah, thank you for that too. Yeah, I'm doing well, as again, sort of considering the circumstances. It's kind of fun that it's 420 and we get to record this on 420, so it's a little bit of a celebratory day. But as you know, we always keep it real, and we're going to talk about some serious stuff in this episode because that's what we do. So let's get right into it. I guess my preference, I'll say, is I use the word cannabis when I refer to weed, marijuana, whatever. And the reason behind that is just because I think it's a little bit more neutral in the sense that it doesn't have the racist history that marijuana has. There's tons of different names for this plant that you can do all sorts of things with, but most notoriously you smoke or eat. So yeah, let's get into it. Anybody want to add to that comment?
You know what? Of course, I would love to add to that comment, Kat, because this is typically what we do with the Joe and Kat Chat series. Realistically, there is not much of a difference, actually, between marijuana and cannabis. Cannabis really describes the actual product in general, cannabis products, where marijuana refers specifically to cannabis products that are made from the dried flowers, the stems, and the leaves and the seeds of the cannabis plant. So when people say marijuana and cannabis, they're actually talking about the same plant, but cannabis describes the overall larger product in general. If you remember an episode that we did several months ago, we talked about the difference between, I think, a consumer good and a capital good, if I'm not mistaken. And I know I'm digging way, 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 way back in the history of the Joe and Kat Chat series. In using that context, the capital good would be cannabis, and marijuana would be, actually, let me rephrase that. The marijuana would be the capital good, and then cannabis would be the consumer good, would be the products made from it. So, for example, CBD oil, brownies. How about hemp seed? I love hemp seed. It's excellent. It has all your amino acids. It's a low carb high source of protein. I use it frequently. I love it. It tastes great. So hemp seed is another form of a cannabis product that comes from the marijuana plant. Yeah, there's hemp clothing. Okay, there's all sorts of ways you can use hemp. I think it was, I want to say Benjamin Franklin, way back in the late 1700s or early 1800s, said that hemp should be the plant that should be used in the United States more so than cotton, because hemp has far more uses than cotton, and hemp is easier to grow than cotton. But what happened? Cotton was used instead of hemp because there is obviously a market for there's hemp, because it is so strong. There's less of a reason for it to, you can use it, you can't use it over and over again. cotton, because after a while you have to get rid of it. But with hemp, it's constantly regenerative. You can use it over and over and over again. It has a longer life. So from a capitalist perspective, it would make sense to make products that have a shorter lifespan as opposed to products that have a longer lifespan. So naturally, there is less of an incentive, for example, to use hemp, for example, hemp in construction materials, because hemp is it's mold resistant, it's antifungal, and it's actually in some cases stronger than steel. But let's go ahead and chop down trees and use wood because capitalism. So there's plenty of reasons as to why you would want to use cannabis and or marijuana. There's plenty of people commenting already. People are getting their smoke on and talking about this. Let's get to some comments because we like participation. My guy Jody, what's up, Jody? Saying cannabis is the shortened name of the plant marijuana, which is Mexican Spanish for cannabis. See, same word. He obviously watched the language episode also. We appreciate that. We appreciate that. Connor saying CBD has helped my panic disorder eons more than previous substances and prescriptions. And there's plenty of evidence to support that cannabis has incredibly useful medicinal purposes, more than what the pharmaceutical industry has to offer, especially when it comes to panic disorders, anxiety, indigestion, and recovery from cancer treatment, most specifically chemotherapy.
Yeah, for sure. Oh my gosh, that was really interesting. I totally did not think of all of that when I was preparing for today's episode. So thank you for that, Joe. Stacy Marie, do you want to contribute anything to sort of this conversation about the differences in cannabis versus marijuana versus weed, all the terminology?
Yeah, you folks gave such a robust intro. I do think the note about language is super important. I think that also acknowledging that cannabis, that language ties back to the cannabis sativa plant, so the original plant we're talking about. And I do think the acknowledgement that marijuana is a racially loaded term now, but on the other spectrum of that, cannabis is almost quite clinical, and it's like I'm supporting someone in bringing CBD into their pain management program right now. And it's like, when we talk about it as CBD or cannabis, it feels okay. But because they're of that generation where marijuana or weed was still really like reefer madness type of era, they're not comfortable with the word marijuana. But we talk about it as cannabis. She's okay talking about it. So I think, yeah, language matters.
Yeah, that's such an interesting distinction, especially for folks that are a bit older and, grew up with that sort of reefer madness generation, or propaganda really is what it was. Yeah, and so I just kind of put a note here saying that marijuana is a term that it was used historically to perpetuate the myth that marijuana is dangerous, addictive, only consumed by delinquents, and it is meant to perpetuate xenophobic sentiments against Mexicans and more broadly Latinx folks particularly. So that's sort of a little bit of the history. And I guess now I think we should bring race into the mix because obviously there is some problematic history with the word marijuana, but I mean, race, we talk about this often here on the Joe and Kat Chats, and you can't divorce one from the other. So.
I can maybe start with a kind of Canadian context, because I know we're gonna talk about same bucket, but maybe different areas of the bucket. That was a terrible analogy, but yeah. So in Canada, federally, cannabis has been legalized at a federal level since 2018. This is after many decades of it being highly controlled, Schedule I, initially under the Opium and Drugs Act, which really marks in Canadian history the beginning of an extremely over-racialized discourse around who is consuming drugs. In this case, it was firmly anchored to anti-Asian sentiment. And then in the 60s, it kind of shifted to the Narcotics Control Act, which came with those mandatory minimum sentences and all of those punishments, which of course are enacted by police, which, as you talk about all the time, is a system latent with racism. So the shift to legalization in Canada has been kind of, and I'm sure we'll get into this, it has been kind of now been lifted as a case study in how not to legalize cannabis. So the Cannabis Act of 2018, it comes with 3 goals: to protect young people, to promote public health, and to reduce the illegal market of cannabis. And one of the main critiques of this system, in framing it by as a public health kind of act, instead of a social justice one, we're opening up the door to increase policing, which it has since the legalization in Canada. In Canada, we've devoted more resources to policing, and we know that all these, historical punitive measures are rife with like a legacy of racism. And I also have notes to talk about later around what it meant for people with existing records, but we can get into that. So in my kind of opinion, the assessment of Canada's legalization is really more about enforcement than it ever was when it was illegal.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That's very true. I mean, there's a lot of issues that went on over the last few years in Canada regarding the legalization, and it did not go well. And there's still a large, quote unquote, illegal trade, which we can talk about later as well. Because, Joe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there's obviously a history of racism with marijuana. We've seen that in the United States. I mean, we could talk about the war on drugs from the 60s and 70s. The documentary 13 talks about the war on drugs in great detail. Much of that conversation focused on crack cocaine, but a lot of it did extend to marijuana. Let's take a look, and it gets with the quote unquote reefer madness days, and you had a bunch of white kids in the late 60s that were protesting the Vietnam War. They were against the Vietnam War. And you had a whole lot of young Black people that were protesting the war also. And part of the quote unquote war on drugs and part of the way to criminalize Black people in the United States was to use different types of drugs as a way to force Black people into a corner for police persecution. So much of this has history in unfair policing, in over-criminalizing Black people for possession of marijuana as opposed to white people. And this is extended into other forms of drugs, most notably the anti-drug bill of 1988, which was written by none other than Joe Biden. The Rave Act of 2002, which cracked down on drugs being used at live event venues and was designed to actually curb ecstasy at parties. But what it did, it created this massive dragnet for anybody involved in the promotion of a live event or a warehouse party or a venue to get caught up in the prosecution of a drug case. And what it also did, one of the unintended consequences of this is that it instantly reduced harm reduction at music venues and warehouse parties and other live music events. Because if you have a harm reduction personnel at a particular venue, police are going to look and say, wait a minute, why are you having harm reduction at a live event venue? Why would you need harm reduction if there was nothing there that could potentially be harmful? There must be drugs. Police, now at that point, you would have potentially probable cause to go in and take a look around and see what's there. So, and of course, the coup de grace from Joe Biden, the 1994 Omnibus Crime Act, which which exploded the prison population. It disproportionately locked up more black people and brown people more than white people. It built more jails. It reestablished the federal death penalty, and it also criminalized non-payment of child support. It also spent a whole lot of money on police militarization. Take a look at what you have right now going on in various cities across these United States regarding the Derek Chauvin trial and the potential verdict that is due to be. We're due to know about that any minute now. So all of this comes from drugs. All of this comes from greed. And in the United States right now, there are 31 of the 50 states that have decriminalized marijuana. What needs to happen now is all 50 states need to decriminalize marijuana. All 50 of them, not 49, not all 50, and Washington, D.C., and all territories of the United States, Guam, Marshall Islands, Puerto Rico, wherever. You're a territory, it's legal. What also needs to happen is the expungement of any criminal records for anybody that has been put into jail for a possession charge or any nonviolent offense involving marijuana. It's a frigging plant. You didn't hurt anybody. No one got killed. It's a plant. It's a plant. I like kale. Am I going to go to jail because I eat kale? Or put kale in my smoothies? Really? Kale's a plant. So why criminalize one and sell another one at a grocery store? Is this what we're doing in this? Is this really what we're doing in America? Is this what we're doing in Canada? Where's the friggin' common sense? Where do you draw the distinction? Granted, you can't necessarily get high off of kale, all right? And I understand that. There's probably a lot less use. You can't really build a house with kale or make a pair of socks with kale, all right? But kale is a plant nonetheless, just like marijuana or cannabis. Stop the madness. Stop the madness. We need all these old fuddy-duddies in Washington, D.C. to get their head out of their asses because at home they're smoking weed too. They're smoking weed too. But then again, they might not be doing that because they might be doing crack cocaine, and because they're old and they're white, they end up with white privilege and end up not getting any punishment for it at all because of the crack bill that Joe Biden wrote up. So we need some friggin' common sense in not only Canada but the United States. Decriminalize weed, make weed legal across the country. Anyone who's in jail because of a bullshit weed charge, let them out, expunge their records, and then help them subsidize them so they can become cannabis entrepreneurs as a form of reparations for them being behind bars unnecessarily.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, and I think that.
And real quick.
Go ahead.
I should be real quick. Just to kind of sum up everything here. All right, I can't be president of the United States because I wasn't born in the United States. But if I were president of the United States, I would have carpal tunnel syndrome for the amount of executive orders I would write. One of those executive orders would be legalizing weed across the country. The second one would be creating that reparations plan focused on marijuana for cannabis entrepreneurs who are to become cannabis entrepreneurs for anybody that's been locked up behind bars. Additionally, and I want to make sure I get this in, Kamala Harris, the vice president of the United States, illegally locked up a whole lot of black and brown people for possession of marijuana when she was attorney general in California and when she was city state's attorney in San Francisco. She was the top cop in California and the top cop in San Francisco. Now she's going to try to not pass marijuana legislation, even though she said, oh, well, I smoked a little weed when I was younger and I smoked a little weed when I was in college. Okay, she's lying. She's lying. She's trying to placate people, to try to pander to people to make sure that she seems cool. She's not cool. She's a cop. She's not your friend. Don't trust her.
Yeah, thank you for saying all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, there's a difference. We need to be fighting for both because there is a difference between legalizing on a federal level because cannabis is still considered a Schedule I substance, which is like ridiculous. And sort of the local decriminalizations or more local in like states, because there's I think you said 31 out of 50 states that have decriminalized, but there's also a difference between whether it's medically decriminalized or legalized and for recreational use. And I think that there is many examples, to refer back to what Stacy Marie said a few minutes ago. There's so many examples now of how different states and how Canada did poorly when they legalized, that we can sort of do case studies and do it in a much better way in the US moving forward. So yeah, does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, I have a few points. This happened last time we all talked to you. I'm like, oh, I got to mention that. And I make a note, and then there's a whole tree of notes to talk about. For folks who are interested in this, specifically the Canadian context and the topic of racialized policing or Canada's mishandling of people who currently have cannabis-related charges on their record, Dr. Uwasu Bempa out of University of Toronto is the go-to Canadian scholar in this area. Everything he puts out is absolutely amazing. I've seen him speak on a few panels. And so a lot of his work has been around the kind of racialized and the mishandling of cannabis. And I do want to kind of talk about how it played out here. So in Trudeau's government in 2018, who really used legalizing cannabis federally as an election issue. Throughout all of that, never engaged with Indigenous communities around what this could look like on reserve lands, around what this would look like for self-governing nations. So that was like error number one in a chain of errors in talking about opportunities for reconciliation and opportunities to have First Nations generate revenue independently. None of that was discussed. None of the tax windfalls of this was brought into conversation with Indigenous communities. And then there was the records expungement. So there's right now about 500,000 Canadians currently with a criminal record still for cannabis possession. Last summer, the government launched a program to waive the fee for people to get their records pardoned. And an important distinction is that a pardon of a record is not the same as an expungement, right? The process to get a pardon is very extensive. So although they waived the $615 fee, it's still a very complex paper trail navigating the bureaucracy of government. So it's not super easy to do. Whereas another option that the government has is to just say that this law doesn't exist anymore. So let's get rid of all of these records, or, like, let's expunge them. This isn't a law. This never happened. Erase, 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 rather than just a pardon, which still does exist on your record. So right now, yeah, there's 500,000 Canadians who have barriers to employment, have barriers to housing, cannot get into the legal game, the legal industry, cannot apply for a permit because they are living with these criminal records. They expected that about 10,000 Canadians would apply for this pardon system. And the most recent article I found said that less than 300 had been granted.
Wow. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of issues that are still ongoing, I guess, in Canada here with the quote unquote legalization of cannabis. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. Joe, do you have something to add?
Yeah, question for you, Stacey. Stacey, why do you think that there's been so few permits that have been administered so far?
So few pardons?
Yes.
I think
pardons.
That there isn't. I think it could be two things, and I read a little bit into this. One is that, like, cannabis is so much more widely accepted that people it doesn't really maybe bother them that they have a tiny possession amount on their record. They maybe have enough privilege that it's not impacting their ability to work, etc.
Okay. Sure.
The second thing is I think that it's buried. It's buried in the bureaucracy of how to do it, and they haven't, as far as I'm aware, put any resources to helping people navigate all of that paperwork and getting copies of your ID and like all of these extensive other things that people might not have, or they might not have access to, or even knowing they've waived the $600 fee, there's a lot of expense in, getting something to a notary and getting things signed and all of these bureaucratic steps to doing that.
Yeah, I know that bureaucracy firsthand because I am actively applying for my Trinidad and Tobago passport, and it is a mountain of paperwork, and you got to get stuff notarized. You have to get stuff from parents, and in some cases grandparents. And if you have been incarcerated for a period of time and you've lost contact with family members that may have access to that paperwork, you might not be able to get that paperwork, which kind of leads me to another question, Stacey, and maybe there's data on this that you were able to acquire. Is there any sort of breakdown racially between the people who have been pardoned and who have not? I would imagine because you mentioned this word. You said the word privilege in this in your previous comment, which led me to ask this question. I would imagine that in Canada, probably similarly to the United States, that more Black and brown people are not getting pardoned and more white people are.
Okay, so here's the kicker on this.
Ooh.
And when I learned this, I was absolutely floored. And I learned it through Professor Owasu Bempa.
Okay.
Canada only recently started to collect crime and police data disaggregated by race. So we do not have an accurate breakdown of how many people are in the criminal justice system by race anyway, which is shocking. And when I say recent, I say within the last 5 years, we've started collecting that data.
Yeah, thanks to the Harper decade. Yeah. So Harper was the conservative leader of Canada prior to Justin Trudeau. He had a minority government for many of the 10 years, and he basically erased any acknowledgement or I guess data collection for Statistics Canada of anything that could cause social programs to be bolstered, basically. So he stopped collecting any gender-based violence information, race information, things that people like me, sociologists, can use to create reports or do research on to bolster social programs, because he was a very conservative leader. So yeah, so Justin Trudeau was elected, and only, like you say, only about 5 years ago we started collecting this information. He re-implemented the long form census, but I mean, we lack data for, I think the latest long form census we have is 2006 with a lot of that information. And again, the police record stuff is a totally different, problematic thing.
Sure. Kat, there's something you said earlier when you mentioned the scheduling of drugs. And I used to have this committed to memory, but there's sometimes you just forget stuff because there's other stuff that enters your mind, and your brain can only hold so much information. I want to make sure that everybody understands what the scheduling of drugs are, where marijuana falls on the scheduling in comparison to other drugs that are on the schedule. Now, there are 5 schedules of drugs, and the drugs fall under the Roman numeral scheduling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or I, V, and the letter V. So just to keep that in mind. Now, the controlled substances are legal for prescription drugs is regulated by the Controlled Substances Act in the United States. Now, the schedules, they're really more classes of drugs, and there's 5 classes of drugs: narcotics, depressants, stimulants, hallucinogens, and anabolic steroids. Okay, so once again, the 5 classes of drugs are narcotics, depressants, stimulants, hallucinogens, and anabolic steroids. Schedule 1 drugs, just so everybody knows. Schedule 1 drugs are drugs that are accepted for safety of use under medical supervision. Examples are GHB, heroin, LSD, and of course, marijuana. And marijuana is the only Schedule 1 drug that is legal for medicinal and recreational use in 31 of the 50 states. A whole lot of people around the United States believe that marijuana's drug status should be changed to show how beneficial and useful it is across the board. So marijuana is under the same schedule as GHB, heroin, and LSD. Let's take a look at Schedule 2. Schedule 2 are substances that have high potential for abuse. Examples of Schedule 2 drugs are cocaine, methamphetamines, morphines, and phencyclidine, otherwise known as PCP, and methadone. So, Schedule 2 drugs can lead to severe psychological or physical dependence. So marijuana is on a higher tier than coke, meth, morphine, and PCP. Okay? We'll continue on because I think this is irrelevant to the conversation. Schedule 3 drugs have a low or moderate physical dependence or high psychological dependence. Schedule 3 drugs examples are anabolic steroids, codeine, or hydrocodone, which is something that you would get with aspirin or Tylenol. And anabolic steroids can be a problem if you overuse them. Schedule 4 drugs have a low potential for use relative to Schedule 3 drugs. Schedule 4 drugs, Valium, Xanax, these are Schedule 4 drugs, and these are on a different tier than Schedule 1 drugs where marijuana is located. Schedule 5 drugs are currently accepted for medical use across the United States. And there's plenty of examples of those, stuff like Tylenol, stuff you can get over the counter. Those are Schedule 5s. So when you think about, I certainly think I think the pharmaceutical industry has something to do with the scheduling of marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug as opposed to maybe even a Schedule 4 or a 5 drug, which is probably where it belongs. Because if you look at the various uses of marijuana, there's no way marijuana should really be a Schedule 1 drug. I mean, people smoked marijuana long before doctors knew what to do with it. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
personally, like everything should be decriminalized, and I have a whole problem with that whole system because also like why is LSD a Schedule 1? But I think those schedules, the idea that any one substance has more potential for addictions is just, it's absolute garbage to me because it doesn't work like that. It's not as if they inherently have something about them that can be universally applied to everyone. It totally ignores all of the social determinants of health, all of the realities of trauma, the lack of safety nets that people have. Like those also play into how likely someone is to habitually use whatever substance. And also, like, let's talk about alcohol. Like, how many people come home and, pound a bottle of wine because they had a bad day or crush a 6-pack, and we're not talking about the potential for misuse of that within schedules. So toss it all out, really.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, yeah, it's funny you bring alcohol in because it's like, yeah, it's just so rampant in our culture to just be able to openly abuse alcohol use, tobacco, particularly like nicotine, which is the addictive substance in there, and like things like caffeine and coffee, tea, chocolate. Those things are also drugs that we are just openly able to use. I mean, as adults, with particularly with the first two there, but yeah, I mean, I wonder if we can sort of shift into sort of how to talk about safe use of cannabis. Should somebody want to use it with all of these factors sort of that we have been talking about? I'm curious to know sort of the harm reduction perspective on safe use personally, but also just sort of to tie that into sort of the more you know, the broader aspects of this, you know, with race being considered, with, you know, policing being considered. So.
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe starting from a legal context is obviously people should be familiar with what their laws are in their area, right? Because while that might not be a risk as much in Canada, if cannabis is illegal in your state, that you have to keep in mind to ways to reduce the risk that comes with that. And then also recognizing that in Canada, I do want to say that cannabis is still illegal for people under 19. And because people who are under 19 are still able to be policed for cannabis use, that's an important recognition, because we know that in having one of the aims of the Cannabis Act be the protection of young people, it has resulted in an over-surveillance of youth, particularly continued over-surveillance of racialized youth. And we know that marijuana isn't a gateway drug in terms of leading to other drugs. It's a gateway into the criminal justice system. So youth can still be penalized and policed. So the legal aspects aside, cannabis is a relatively low risk psychoactive substance. The harms of cannabis tend to be lower than that of tobacco or that of alcohol. We do know from a health perspective that one of the biggest ways to avoid health complications is to try to stay away from it if you're still under 16. There is a lot of data to support that if people start smoking marijuana before age 16, they are more prone to longer term complications. But in adults, really, it's all about protecting your lungs if you are smoking it. So consider using a vaporizer. Try to avoid like taking really deep breaths and holding your breath. Just kind of smoke it a bit more easily. You don't need to hold it into your lungs to get those effects. For people who use like vapes, be very mindful of like aftermarket additives to oils that go in your vapes. That's kind of an unregulated wild west market. We know particularly vitamin E and other oils can be quite. Your lungs are sensitive, delicate little organs with a really important job, so you want to treat them kindly. I know our friends in the UK won't like this, but it is recommended to avoid mixing it with tobacco, but I know that spliffs are super popular. But if we're talking harm reduction measures. And then I did want to also acknowledge, like, if people are new to cannabis, if it's 420, they're looking to experiment, I recommend not starting with edibles. Edibles are like, you kind of have to have a bit of experience with cannabis under your belt. Edibles can have much higher potency than just smoking weed. So ease into the edible game, really know the product, get it from a store who will take the time to educate you. Start with lower dose THC and work your way up, and give it time to work. So take a little bite of like a cookie or a brownie, wait it out, wait an hour before dosing again. And then I also do want to say that cannabis also really ramps up psychedelics. So if you're going to be using the two, if you're not well versed in that area, avoid cannabis altogether while you're maybe on mushrooms or acid. But if you are going to, wait till that peak of the psychedelic wears off, because consuming cannabis at the peak can really ramp up the psychedelic experience and can send people into a little bit of distress. So that's kind of the health perspective. I did also want to note, if you're obviously you're not traveling right now due to COVID, but keep a reminder that even knowing weed is legal in Washington and legal in Canada, you cannot cross the border with it. And something to keep in mind if you're flying too, even if you're flying domestic, if there is a chance that your flight could run into trouble and have to dip down and stop in America, you are subject to American laws. They do not care that your flight did not plan to land across the border but had to, and you could be subject to law. So it's best just not to travel. Just pick up whatever you're getting where it's legal when you land. Those are my top harm reduction tips.
Thank you. That was great. And I didn't actually know about the flight thing. I just like assumed that you could just carry whatever you needed to as long as it was like within the continental, country. I guess, that it's legal. So that is very good to know. Joe, do you have anything to add?
There was a question that I had for Stacy about using marijuana and psychedelics, because I think I might have done mushrooms once in my life and I didn't feel anything from it. And I've smoked weed exactly 4 times in my life and I didn't like how I felt after I did it each time. So I just said, you know what, the hell with this, I'm not doing this. But why does what in marijuana creates this adverse effect with psychedelics? Why are you not supposed to mix the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not that you're not supposed to. It's an effect that we call potentiation, which basically at the receptor level of our brain, the cannabis potentiates the action of the psychedelic. So it can kind of it's like cranking up the heat, sort of. So all of the effects of the psychedelics will be really potentiated, like kicked into high gear, which is why some people like it as their trip from the psychedelics is wearing down, because it can reactivate those receptors can be reactivated and it can pick it back up and maybe sustain it. But yeah, it's that potential. And to be fair, some people like that. Some people like the potentiating effect it is applying. Gotcha. So I don't want to give the impression that it's a dangerous or deadly combo and people shouldn't do it, but it's definitely something I recommend more for veterans of both cannabis and psychedelics. Like if it's your first time whiling out, it's 420, you're going to take some mushrooms, someone passes you a joint, which by the way, in COVID, you should not be sharing joints.
That's true.
You're kind of like trying a bit of everything. There is a very strong chance you might feel very overwhelmed by taking that cannabis with the psychedelic.
Interesting. So potentiation would be somewhat, I guess, somewhat similar to peanut butter, for example. You could eat peanut butter or almond butter by itself, but there are some things you would want to put peanut butter with, like chocolate, but then you wouldn't necessarily want to put peanut butter with pizza, for example, right? But if you put peanut butter kind of after you eat pizza, that's sort of okay, and it won't affect you as much. But if you put it together, it could really just tear everything up.
I love that you're using this flavor analogy, and it's great. And I'm right there with you. I'm going to amend it a bit in episode, I think 3 or 4 of my show, Sanctuary Radio.
Real quick. Where can everybody hear Sanctuary Radio?
Yeah, Sanctuary Radio airs on Dash Radio. So the best way is to download the Dash Radio app, find the Tastemakers channel, and then tune into your folks' show at 11 and mine at 1. Wednesdays are so fire on this channel.
That's exactly right. Just wanted to make sure everybody knew that ahead of time, because it's important that we plug the Tastemakers Radio channel on the Dash Radio network.
Yes, Wednesdays are so good. Such good music and such good learning opportunities.
Absolutely. It's the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
It's edutainment.
Edutainment.
Yes.
So I have an episode where Alex, an amazing harm reductionist, they kind of talk about different drugs as flavors. And so, when you're just starting to cook, it's a really good idea to know what the flavors are before you start combining them, because you might have that peanut butter on pizza moment. And so rather than just, you're not like, ooh, I'm going to cook for the first time, what are all of these spices? Could end up as a disaster. Same kind of applies to substance use. However, with the idea of potentiation, I would think of potentiation maybe more as a hot sauce, right? Some people love hot sauce. It can really bring out the flavor of whatever you're cooking, but for other people, it's too much. That's kind of how I would describe it.
And I purposely didn't use the hot sauce analogy, and I thought about that. But the reason why is because nobody eats hot sauce by itself. No one looks in their refrigerator and says, this hot sauce is looking good. Let me have some of that. And just gargles them down some hot sauce. Nobody does that. But you put hot sauce on your mashed potatoes or your cauliflower or your broccoli or your steak or whatever, whatever makes reasonable sense. And you put it on top and it makes everything taste better. It's kind of like salt and pepper in that instance.
Fair.
Nobody looks in their refrigerator and says, yo, this pink Himalayan salt's got my name on it. I'm going to munch on this while I watch some Netflix. Nobody does that. But if you have some salt, you might want to put it on, maybe put some salt in your chocolate chip cookie mix to bring out the extra flavors, disparities, whatever the case may be. You know what I mean? Or you put some in your smoothie, or you put it in your soup. Nobody actually eats salt or pepper on its own because it's supposed to be an accessory, not the main dish. So when I thought about potentiation, I was like, you know what, the salt and pepper analogy doesn't really work. And I also thought about, hot sauce, ketchup, mustard. I mean, no one looks in their refrigerator and says, that Miracle Whip mayonnaise. Can't wait. No one does that. You know what I mean? No one's looking at mayonnaise.
Oh my God,
no one's
I'm
looking at mayonnaise like that, right? But I understand and I'm trying to bring up these other examples to try to illustrate the importance of what you said was potentiation. And I was, today years old when the first time I heard that word potentiation. I had no idea I'm looking at you like, potential, what? So thank you for that education, because number one, I love learning. Number two, I know Kat loves learning. And number three, I know our listeners love learning. So anytime we can learn something new on the Joe and Kat Chats franchise, that's something that we're always all about. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and thank you for that other perspective and that kind of gap in my analysis. So I appreciate it. I will say, there is, for people who are thinking about combos and we're just like, what, potentiate? There is this, if you just Google trip sit drug mixing chart, this whole chart comes up that you cross-reference. So you look on one axis and then the other, and it tells you whether a drug is risky to mix, has a potentiating factor, so could potentially make you, doubly as high, or if there's the possibility that one will reduce the effect of the other, because the opposite can happen in some combos. So
is there a word for, because you said potentiation, it makes one drug harmful with another drug. Am I understanding? It brings out, I guess, it enhances what could happen. Is there a specific terminology that's the opposite of potentiation?
There is. Give me a minute. It will come to me.
Okay.
I will burst in when I remember it. I have to think for a moment. I did want us to kind of end our conversation on ethical consumption.
Yes.
If anyone has any ideas around that, well, I look.
Yeah, thank you for all of that, and that's kind of where I wanted to go to. I just wanted to. I posted on my Instagram today. There was this great compilation of 42 Black and Indigenous by person of color owned brands that are cannabis brands. They have all sorts of different kinds of products. They don't all sell like bud to smoke. They sell all sorts of different things, and I posted that on my stories, and I will post it in the show notes to a link to it, because I thought that was a really great way to celebrate 420, because I do think that because of the corporal system and the way that it has, cannabis has been, criminalized for BIPOC folks, overwhelmingly being represented in the corporal system. I think it's really important that as consumers, we need to be seeking out BIPOC folks that own and operate these cannabis companies.
Yeah, definitely. I also, on the Sanctuary_radio Instagram, shared a story with tagged a whole bunch of different accounts of BIPOC owned or women owned, queer owned companies. And because that's really what it comes down to, right? Is that cannabis it's now intersected with capitalism hugely. There was one policy brief that looked at 700 executives of cannabis companies in Canada, which was 185 licensed products and their parent companies, and found that 84% of cannabis industry leaders in Canada were white, and 16% were non-white. And then within that kind of whiteness, because obviously white race and gender need to be also looked at. 86% of the white folks were white men, and 14% were white women. So that's really who's making the money here. So like anything, you have a choice to vote with your dollar, and really please do seek out companies who are, women owned, BIPOC owned, giving back to the community. It's not so much a thing in Canada, but America has a lot of like worker co-ops. So not just that you're giving your money to equity seeking communities, but also there's worker equity, there's environmental sustainability built into these. So seek out co-ops if you can. I love the idea of a worker co-op. I think Canada needs to get on that train as well. Oh, and I can't find the word. I'm sorry. It's escaping me. It's not synergy. It's something else, but the opposite of potentiate. Okay. Aggravate. We'll use aggravate, or no, attenuate, but that's not the right word.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Wow. All right. A lot of 4-syllable words today. Kat, one of the BIPOC-owned companies that is owned, that does marijuana and cannabis, is a company called Viola. They're quite prominent in the African American community. It is owned by former NBA player Al Harrington. He's done bunches of interviews with various sports, with the NBA, and Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson, two other basketball players who are prominent users of marijuana, have been in conversation with NBA Commissioner Adam Silver to make marijuana use acceptable for NBA players as a way to not only heal from injuries, but a way to for the healing properties of marijuana. So Viola is an outstanding company. I think they have a YouTube channel, if I'm not mistaken. And Al Harrington is doing quite well with Viola. And there's plenty of reports to suggest he's hired a lot of people for his organization. And there's plenty of information to suggest that he's on his way to being a billionaire simply with cannabis. That's in addition to the NBA money that he's made. And he played in the NBA for 16 years coming straight out of high school. So he's doing a lot of good work in the community. He's giving back to the community. So thank you for saying that. We just want to make sure that, and again, we have about 2.5 minutes left, that 81% of cannabis owners are white, 4.3% are Black. So we want to make sure we understand that. Black folks are 264 times more likely to be arrested than white folks for cannabis possession, even though they use at similar rates. So there's plenty of Black folks that smoke weed. There's plenty of white folks that like to smoke. And there's a lot of times where I've seen Black folks and white people smoke together. I've always said that there's two things that bring people together, food and music. We might as well add weed to the list, because if you got some good weed, Black folks and white folks will get together, and conflict just seems to go out the window. All right. In states where cannabis is legal, Black people are still arrested more than white people for possession, which, again, we need to do something about. Marijuana no one should go to jail because of weed. It's stupid. Overall, about 693,000 cannabis arrests happened about 2 or 3 years ago, I think in either 2018 or 2019. Of those, 90% were simply for possessing a plant. Simply for possession. So America needs to do better with their marijuana laws. We need to stop the racism that is embedded and rooted in marijuana. There's the pathway to becoming a cannabis entrepreneur is significantly more difficult for Black people than it is for white people. Obviously, much of that is rooted in wealth inequality from a historical perspective. That needs to change. And again, let everybody out of jail that's behind bars for cannabis possession. Let them out, throw out the records, hit delete in your computer. That way it never existed. Annul the record. Give these people cannabis entrepreneur jobs. Give these people cannabis entrepreneur jobs, and let these people live the lives they should be living. Please.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. And I wish we could talk about this forever because it's so interesting, this topic, but we have to wrap up, unfortunately. So thank you so much, Stacy Marie, for being our first guest ever on Joe and Cat Chats. Of course, thank you, Joe, as always. You always bring it and bring the facts, and I love it. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the episode. Find us on Tastemakers Radio every Wednesday.
Peace.